So welcome everyone to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. This is Brett, Pleasure of Doubt, and we have with us today Jordan Hall, who has been eagerly anticipated by our audience here. And so I think a lot of people know Jordan, but Jordan is he's built a career building disruptive technology companies. He studied contemporary philosophy, artificial intelligence, and complex system science, followed by attending Harvard Law School, where he examined the co-evolution of human civilization and technology. He then participated in putting his skills to combining disruptive technology, movement building, and going up against obsolete oligopolies. He joined MP3.com, then Interview, and then he led the online digital video revolution as a founder and CEO of DivX. He left the helm at DivX and participated in a number of think tanks and institutes, such as the Aspen Institute and the Santa Fe Institute, where he served on the board of trustees for 5 years. He then has moved on to co-founding the Neurohacker Collective. And so thank you for being here, Jordan.
You're welcome. Good Lord, it's the first time I've had to endure a biography in quite some time.
Apologies for that. I never know how much detail to go into. So Jordan, you have in some ways a pretty dismal prediction for the future of humanity, but you also see a potential for an optimistic outcome. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Which part?
Well, why don't we start about the dismal prediction?
Well, so I guess since we're talking to this particular group in this particular way, it seems, I think, right to begin with the proposition of being non-attachment. So I have a sense of what are the most likely future states on the various trajectories that we're on, and it does seem to be the case that if you were to take most people would not like most of the more likely directions. Maybe that's a good way of putting it. The vast majority of people alive today, I suspect, would prefer most of the most likely forward trajectories not be the ones that occur. So then this one question is why? Why would I say that's the case? What's the basis of that proposition? And then, as you say, there's the other thing, which is say, okay, well, what's the spread of scenarios that I believe are likely to happen, and what's the likelihood of them happening, and then finally agency. What kinds of things might we do to be able to steer the new so that it's ending up on the places we would like it to be? The answer to the question of why it is that I come to these particular conclusions, unfortunately, is not simple. It's a pretty large body of work, including a lot of people, many of whom were quite obscure when I was working with them and are not obscure any longer, which is an interesting sign that they're at least timely people, if not also timely and capable. So we can go into that if you'd like, but the bigger picture is sort of lots of people earnestly endeavoring to engage with what is real, and thereby recognizing that there are perhaps ways of modeling the ways that things like cultures and civilizations, and as well as energetic systems and living systems evolve, and leading to the conclusion that under most circumstances, the ones that we're in right now are headed for a bad end. And by the way, that same theory indicates that all hope is not lost, and that in fact there's a decent chance of not just a kind of an okay end, but a really good one, right? So I guess the key message that I'd like to put out there is that that we do actually have a bit of a fork in the road, and that most of the probability is based upon our choices, not upon the context or the causal structure we find ourselves in. Does that make sense, that last part?
Yeah, well, you were speaking in your recent Voices with Vervecki. You spoke with John about the importance of looking at the shape of a network rather than the content of it, and you call this an important insight. And I think that sounds like what you're getting to here. Maybe you can break it down for us a little more.
Okay, well, Okay, sure. Let me do something that's very timely. Although I know you mentioned that this particular group is more focused on maybe the more spiritual side than the political side. We can use the political side to give us perspective on certain things. So, for example, just as a for example, it's obviously a vast topic. Uh, the thing that's happening right now in the United States, in terms of the breakdown of the structure of the thing called policing,
Mm-hmm.
um, from my point of view, is of a sort. It's of a kind that is similar to the breakdowns of lots of other kinds of things. And therefore, and sometimes it's quite predictable that this particular thing would break down at this time at this level of intensity is not quite as easy to predict. If you said, okay, here's a box of 50 things, one of them for sure is going to break down, and that breakdown will look like this. And by the way, it will be followed by these kinds of things. That's much more doable. So, for example, the kind of network design that is associated with policing has a it's funny. Like Foucault was actually the guy who originally began to analyze this, which had to do with for example, the notion that the role of policemen is a formal concept, and that there is a governance mechanism which lives outside of the role of policemen, lives in a different domain. That governance mechanism defines and designs what is the content of the formal role of policemen. Separately, there's a governance mechanism that collects individual actual human beings and puts them into that particular category in particular ways, right? So you've got this system dynamic that has certain kinds of characteristics of how it fundamentally operates, and by the way, has then different characteristics of how it actually is traversing, how the abstraction or its formality is actually instantiating in reality. But you can take a look at the formality and say, okay, this formal system has, for example, it has a certain amount of complexity that it can manage, and therefore is going to have a built-in error rate, and it's going to have a built-in adaptivity to change. So if the environment is changing faster than some number, some amount, some quantity of change, this particular control system won't be able to keep up, and it'll actually go into a breakdown in control. For example, that's a whole giant piece of kind of adapting cybernetic control theory and network theory to take a look at that particular concrete event. So, running at a very intellectual level, not the least bit spiritual, we could say that the kind of network design that we have has a certain fate to it, has a certain set of things that are A, what it can do, and B, what it can't do, and then there's certain things which are going to be its natural tendencies, and its natural tendencies in certain contexts. So then we can do is take a look at what are the contexts that you're putting a network design in, and you have a much richer sense of what are the likely ways that larger system is going to evolve. That felt too theoretical and abstract. What's maybe a better way of grounding it?
Well, what if we ground it in a community like ours? You know, where this is a new community where we've just formed in really the last 2 months. We're almost at our 2-month anniversary. You know, how would you recommend, for example, what should we be thinking of in setting up, you know, our networks? We're in the middle, you know, of crafting roles and responsibilities, and you know, different roles that people are taking within the community. You know, some will be organizing events, other people will be you know maybe leading meditations or other type of sessions. Others will be working on structure. You know, what can we take from your work to help direct us?
Ooh, okay, so there's actually a whole lot of stuff. So let's begin with. I'm going to put it in the form of recommendations as opposed to in the form of options, because the option space is quite large. In terms of recommendations, some things that I would point out are a network design. One of the variables you can look at is the degree to which a particular node and domain, which is to say a cluster of nodes, is specialized or generalized. And so, say, for example, in the military, you tend to have high levels of specialization in for example, decision making. And so the major function in an army has a very specific domain and scope of decision making, and it's very, very important that that particular node know when a decision is in its scope. If it's too big, it has to go up, but if it's too little, it has to go down, like that kind of structure. And notice what happens there is that once you've made a couple of commitments to how you're designing your network, a bunch of other stuff comes with it. Right? So if you design a network that is of the sort of a post-World War II military, then if you want it to be effective at all, a lot of energy, a lot of attention, a lot of the capacity of given individuals actually has to be focused on questions like, is this particular area of inquiry something that is right for my level of authority, or should I push it down, or should I send it up? So you may or may not have been planning on that as being part of what the time you're spending people's time on, but ultimately it's part of you have to, and so it gets smuggled in. And that's I think a thing that people miss a lot is that there's actually some natural network design clusters that once you've made a few choices, a lot of other things follow. Now, in the context of what you guys are doing, what my sense is there's kind of or three things that are happening simultaneously that may be in a little bit of tension, that may be a healthy tension. So on the one hand, I've heard you mention the word community, and it feels to me like in the tone of your voice when you say it, that you actually mean that in the sense of communitas, like a group of people who sense of togetherness or wholeness in being together.
Yes. Yeah.
It may be in the monastic sense more than in the village sense, but all in directionally that way. Equally, there seems to be a sense of a raison d'être, some sort of mission or objective or purpose more than just shared values. But interestingly, that's oriented towards something which is how would I say this? Singular in the domain of purpose, which is to say the religion that's not a religion, for example, in that document. It feels like that may be a particular area of interest. And as you said, the meaning crisis, right? There is not just a calling, there's people are gathered into this community as a consequence of the bell that John has rung. But also there seems to be an awareness or intent to focus in the direction of that calling. So it's not like, hey, we all gathered for the meaning crisis, but now that it's just kind of become a barbecue. But actually a sense that there's something about this calling that has meaningfulness to it, no pun intended, and therefore should have a sensitivity or a. So again, that pulls more in the direction of a monastic community and less in the direction of a sort of general purpose where people live. If you look at the topology of monastic communities, and it's actually interesting because there's a real distinction. Villages have a different natural topology and by necessity than monastic communities. A monastic community has to have more formal structure. It actually has to have certain levels of certain roles that people play, and a lot of rituals that keep disciplined attention while still maintaining the real integrity of community. Like the many monks who I know feel like the level of lived human relationship and community in monasteries is much stronger than in any other place they've ever been. So this would imply orienting towards like ritual, being thoughtful about having certain kinds of ritual practices that create an ease to the discipline is necessary to maintain integrity in relationship to the purpose, while and holding, like making relatively easeful that level of rigor, so that it can then also happen in the context of community. You would also want to, because you're doing something in the domain of community that is virtual, right? We don't really know, it's not easy. Human beings naturally do communal stuff in physical space, particularly around things like food and conviviality. It's harder to do that in a virtual space because we don't have the right context and signals. So I would recommend playfully and experimentally, but nonetheless thoughtfully, making that an object of intent. So wonder what kinds of things might we do to support a deeper felt sense of humanness. Like, do we want to have you played Dungeons and Dragons or a role-playing game, uh, like have our identities have a certain level of richness and playfulness to them, so that when people encounter each other, they're already drawn into something. Like, how do you render the texture and feel of relationality that's necessary for communitas in a virtual environment? And certain, aesthetics is one possible way, and playfulness is another possible way. So that's another chunk. So I'm kind of putting in there, the toolkit includes things like ritual, and intentionally thinking about creating rituals largely to increase rigor while also increasing easefulness. The second one would be to be intentional around things like playfulness and the felt sense of expression of self into a shared space. A third, and this is now, I'm now starting to get a little bit more fluid, is how would I say this? There's a distinction, what I would say, is between two kinds of design. There's a what I might call, after my friend Forrest Landry, an omniscient design, or a propositional design, the blueprint kind, and a transcendent design, or a oriented design, has more of a feeling of intuitive or felt sense. Actually, it's not really intuitive as much as felt sense. And so I might recommend practices that orient groups of people who build their capacity in gathering a shared felt sense in themselves, enhancing their own capacity, their own felt sense, and then using the individual and collective capacity to discern rightness through felt sense as a primary mode of collective design and decision making in how the environment progresses and evolves.
That's
more.
Oh, keep on
going.
going.
Okay,
No, I do not want you to stop. Keep on going.
So the two more that come up, and I'm actually seeing John in my mind's eye now, and hearing his voice, which I can't remember her name. She's an influence of both John's and of Dave Snowden's, and one of the sort of primary thinkers in like how complex systems actually emerge, or how you can design for emergence. It has to do with sort of enabling constraints and disabling constraints. And so thinking in that way, and sort of thinking about this as having a certain necessary autopoiesis to it, is to think about how do you actually identify what are the appropriate enabling constraints and disabling constraints to give structure, while simultaneously engendering the surprise, the insight, and the creativity that actually makes it be a felt organic space. Oh, those are some things. Sorry if they're not they're well thought through. Or
no, that's amazing. I wish. Part of me wishes we just spend the whole rest of the time talking about this, but it is a Q&A, and I want to get to member questions. But thank you so much for that. I'm going to listen to that several times, I think. And actually, and I was happy to know that some of the things you said, I think, are things that we have been doing, and we've been spending a lot of time recently on rituals, and Callie's here in the Q&A right now, and she's really been instrumental in helping build rituals, and we're really experimenting on different methods, and also the felt sense of community of things like Lectio Divina and authentic relating type practices. So I was
a particular ritual domain that I think doesn't get enough attention, and particularly in the West. Like, indigenous communities do this extraordinarily well, and the West tends to do this quite poorly. Have to do with rituals associated with membership, and the recognition. It's so funny because when I say this in a Western context, I feel like there's a sense of contraction. But when it's said in an indigenous context, it's just sort of a natural. It's like a yes, obviously. And in monastic environments, by the way, are much more like indigenous environments. So there's a hey, guess what? There really is a distinction between a novice and an acolyte and a master, and we should be mindful of the reality of that. And that a big part of participation in the community is the deep the suffering, which is to say the undergoing, developmental change in self that is associated with the movement through a series of rituals, each one of which is actually a gateway or a portal that simultaneously generates changes in self that increase your capacity and signifies that those changes have in fact actually occurred, which then gives rise to your ability to participate in aspects of the community that may not have been available to you before it was before the particular state or rituals have been undergone. So that might actually be a very important one. Hard to do, by the way. Hard to invent from scratch. These are the kinds of things that tend to have been the subject of hundreds or thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of years of trial and error in more indigenous or traditional environments.
Yeah, we're trying to draw on traditions, on a wide variety of traditions, as well as maybe, but feeling that we have some room to sort of make them our own in some ways as well. One idea we're playing with is creating the role of aspirant, which is sort of that when people come into the forum, they're automatically named members. But some people they come for a day and they leave. Other people stick around. But the aspirant would be sort of a declaration of intention that we're stepping forward. This is what we want to do. We want to transform. We want to engage in this community and in this process of awakening from the meaning crisis and work together and participate. And so we're sort of working that out now. And maybe there would be a ceremony where you would sort of state some sort of intention, and then you would get the role of aspirant. And
I would recommend something that has real skin in the game and maybe even a level of intensity, to be perfectly frank, because then you can load more on that structure. And one of the characteristics that is a real problem that nobody knows how to deal with is the problem of scaling. So in virtual environments in particular, you can scale rapidly, right? In principle, everybody on the planet could join your Discord tomorrow. Well, probably not that many, but close, like within a couple of days. But of course, in practice, it would destroy your community. And so one of the things that is necessary is to actually have what I guess in companies are called onboarding, but some process that is auto-catalytic, so that as an aspirant, if an aspirant has strength, meaning that they have a capacity of carrying a certain load because they've gone through something, again, that going throughness required enough from them that they have skin in the game. Right? They care. They actually care. Like they actually have some blood in this thing, so that they want it to continue to endure. And again, if skillfully designed, the thing they went through also left its mark on them by just giving them an insight, changed them in a way that actually wove them into the fabric of it, so that they are a natural expression or natural exponent of the thing. And sort of therefore, as they show up in the environment, the essence of the thing percolates more easily, and you can just kind of think about the ratio between how many members can you actually have per unit or per aspirant before you actually start to see decoherence, because there's too little signal for the amount of noise in the environment.
Right. Wow.
By the way,
yeah,
that's a fundamentally hard problem, and as I mentioned, nobody actually knows how to do it well. So anybody who is like what you guys are focusing on makes it almost part of your purpose. And it's like any religion that's not a religion, one of its design requirements is that it must be able to scale without flipping into reciprocal narrowing.
Right.
Good luck. That is a hard problem to solve.
Thank you. And this has been amazing. Thank you so much for this. Now, just before we get to questions, so I did send to Jordan our draft document from the Structure forum channel with the community's sort of draft structure. I think Jordan didn't have time to really look at it before we started, but you took a quick glance at it. I think you said you would have to spend hours just on each line. So, but maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that another time.
Sorry, I'm reading the question you put. In game theory, what would be the progression after distributed organization in equilibrium? a quantum leap in assisted artificial evolution. You want me to answer that?
Sure. Is that the first? I was gonna go to the questions
Oh,
now.
sorry. Then Jester be good. I
Yeah,
completely apologize.
yeah.
I'm jumping ahead.
I'll read. Yeah,
It,
but that's great.
it popped out.
I'll read it out, and we'd love to have your answers. So yes, from Jester be good. Would you? Hey, Jordan, thanks for your time and all the hard work. I understand that in theory, a self-organizing collective system of ideas, beliefs, and practices like Ritnar Civium could be prevented from being overtaken by an authority as long as it was maintained at the Pareto efficiency frontier. And maybe you could explain what that is. What I do not get yet is how does one ensure that a supercult remains in equilibrium at the frontier, and also would one then not be able to call it a supercult because at the frontier there is no epistemic conflict, and therefore a supercult ceases to exist in realization because of this lack of conflict? In game theory, what would be the progression after distributed organization and equilibrium, a quantum leap in assisted artificial evolution?
Um, one, my sense is that Jester be good either is or has some familiarity with Pat Ryan. It was very Pat Ryan-ish in terms of the language. Two, I hope that everybody enjoys the question, because it's the question itself has a feeling of who would it be? It's not Miles Davis. Maybe it's a bit of Coltrane. And okay, so is this something that you'd like me to spend some time on?
Sure. Yes, we would love that.
Wow. Okay, that's cool. Geez Louise. All right, let's see. So what I think would be great is if actually Jester could actually answer the question of or do a little bit more on the prevented from being overtaken by an authority as long as it was maintained at the Pareto efficiency frontier. Maybe 2 sentences on that to orient me on specifically what the context is there, and then we can run.
All right, so why don't we go on to the next question, and while we're doing that, maybe Jester, if you could just expand on that a little bit, or I mean, you can always, I don't know if your mic's working, you can always come on and speak, but so let's move on to the next one, and then we'll come back to that. So from David, student of movement, he's curious as to what your own ecology of practices look like with regard, or your influences with regard to spirituality.
It's a much easier one. So I came into this notion of spirituality largely unwillingly and at a relatively late age, with one big exception that I'll caveat in a moment. So I don't know if you guys know Jim Rutt, but I was very much more like Jim Rutt with regard to this kind of question up until my early 40s, which, by the way, was kind of near the end of Game B. And actually, to be perfectly frank, it was the sensing on my part, the awareness, not even the awareness, the calculation, the rigorous logical calculation that the object space known as spirituality actually had to be part of any viable future state. Therefore, I had to experience it directly. Was what left me into that space. Therefore, I had kind of a hodgepodge of exploration. So, I worked through individuals like Benita Roy and Yasuhiko Kimura, for example, who themselves exposed me to certain things. My wife and I, Vanessa, explored rather broadly a wide variety of different domains. So you pick your poison. I've spent time with people who have deep practice in huge chunks of stuff, ranging from Western esoteric magic and Jewish Kabbalah to embodied specific Tai Chi practices, and many different variations on Buddhism. And the net of it, what I noticed in myself was that my own orientation was always an orientation of, I suppose you might say, metabolism. So maybe it's my punk rock sensibilities, but I never really had any interest, capacity, or desire to copy and emulate with high degrees of precision some existing lineage or practice. But I always felt a high degree of attraction to being in relationship with that practice until I could metabolize for myself my own set of practices that worked. And I'm struggling when I say work, because obviously the question of working is fluid. You're always engaging in life, and you discover to your chagrin that which worked, in fact, didn't work, and then you learn. Um, so I have a kind of an odd bricolage, and what I'd say is the centerpiece of my spiritual practice is parenting. That the continuing orientation of the act of being in relationship with children, in my case, my own children, but not strictly necessarily your own children, um, from the point of view of choosing to take that role as being one of voluntarily giving your time and energy and attention at a very high level to the stewardship of a peer, as they are becoming more embodied, and to take the position of acting as the representative of their highest self or their soul as they are becoming capable of taking responsibility for that themselves. And from my point of view, the advantage of this particular practice is that the world gives you an unending opportunity to fail and learn, and all the different tools you might put in place are always called. So, simple things like, say, awareness practice, mindfulness practices, breath work, different kinds of yoga techniques, toning techniques, are kind of like table stakes to be able to simply maintain your presence and integrity in the context of a 2-year-old who is hell bent on figuring out how to break your concentration, which is beautiful, right? That was what I would say is my core of my practices, with the notion that it's a way of making all the other stuff meaningfully necessary, and always having to hone and build more capacity and skillfulness in deploying the techniques. And then whenever I encounter somebody who has new ideas or new capacities from any kind of domain, I can actually receive them gratefully as things that I can integrate that upgrade my own capacity to continue in that job.
Do you think if organizations like, say, police departments, had mandatory ecologies of practice, a mandatory meditation, tai chi, yoga, that type of thing, that events like we've seen recently might be fewer?
Temporarily, but not in the midterm. The events like we've seen recently are topological variants in structure system or system designs of this sort. So long as there is a fracturing of collective sovereignty, such that there is a formal assignment of particular kinds of responsibility to individuals as a consequence of their occupation of a formal position, you will always end up with the system evolving to this point. It's actually, it can kind of use a previous language, it's very similar to the problem what happens in a parenting relationship, where a parent takes on the formal role of parent, with the sort of authorities and responsibilities that are incumbent upon that role, rather than living as a human being in relationship with another human being, where there's this hugely complex reality to what's happening, and everybody kind of has responsibility for the relationship, even though that responsibility is differentially allocated. So this is one of the interesting challenges that we have, is we tend to try to use certain kinds of tools, like, say, for example, heck's it called, sensitivity training, to plug the holes in the dike, instead of actually getting rid of the dike altogether and learning how to go through an ecology where rivers flow. And that's kind of that notion, that set of distinctions is very much the essence of what I think I'm trying to bring to the conversation, is that the mindset that tries to operate in that fashion. Oh gosh, I was actually just reading a book by that Jim Rutt recommended, called, I think it's called Sand Talkers. It's a gentleman who speaks very much from an indigenous perspective, points out that, if I say this right, gosh, he uses a slightly different language in this, but it's very much the same. He's talking about the second law of thermodynamics, and why do we use this language of the second law of thermodynamics since we don't actually live in a closed system? And he's like, maybe it's because there's this continuous sort of assumption of an intent or desire that is mandatory, that we try to build complicated closed systems, that we have found ourselves in Western science having the second law of thermodynamics be like the second law. If we were to shift our mind and say, oh, actually, what we're actually trying to do is to be stewards of complex systems of which we are expressions and in which we are irrevocably enmeshed, we'd actually have a very different set of challenges in front of us, and therefore we use our tools very differently. Which is actually funny to say the same thing as I just said, but in a very different way. If you actually did a really good job of inculcating these kinds of practices in people whose formal role was police, they would probably quit, and not violently. Like they wouldn't walk out, but they would actually just say, "Hey, I have to let you know that it has become clear to me that I cannot do the thing to which I am committed in the context in which I am permitted to do so. We either have to change this rather thoroughly, or I will have to withdraw so that I am not creating more harm in the world than good."
All right, thank you. Jester Be Good has a follow up. So he says, he clarifies that there exists an allocation such that at least one person is better off and nobody is worse off. So how can that be maintained in practice in a distributed collective at scale?
Hold on. Sorry, let me just turn this off. Feel bad as my dad, but you never write, you never call. Okay, so this is a Pareto curve.
Don't forget Sunday's Father's Day.
Yes. Fortunately, being a father,
you're tuned in.
Intrinsically reminded by people substantially more diligent than me. Got it. Okay. Okay, this is cool. This is a great question. All right, let me see if I can answer this. This is going to take a little bit of time. I apologize. I have to think about this or contemplate it.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. So the key insight has to do with the recognition that game theory doesn't actually operate in a complex environment. Game theory can only operate under any environment where there is a possibility of calculation. By definition, this means that it's an environment that is both discrete and finite, or at least where there's a way of achieving a arbitrarily high degree of probability that the next step will have a diminishing implication on the structure. You could do a kind of a long tail sort and say, okay, at this point I can truncate and assume that it's finite, so I can digitize the analog environment. But as we find out in the reality that human beings happen to live in, that is simply not the case, right? It is, for example, replete with black swans. And causation has so much ambiguity to it that it's actually formally incalculable, meaning that the causal structure isn't actually able to be rendered into a linear fashion in any fashion. What this means is that game theory actually simply isn't applicable. You can't use it as a tool to make choices in the context of an actual complex environment. And so Civium, he's using that reference, or Ritnar, which I like the Hebraic implications. I would just get rid of the A altogether and just have it be RTNR, and tell people that they have to draw a line through it and then refer to it as such. Is actually properly understood as being oriented towards management, but the cultivation of livingness in this complex environment. Okay, now, what does that mean? What it means is, on the one hand, there is a closure of loops is more important than Pareto efficiency. So what does that mean? Hold on. The biggest challenge has to do with the degree to which an individual either fields in themselves that they cannot uh, make effective choices that actually result in effective change. So either because their own agency is so diluted in the environment that their choices are meaningless, or that there is, well, either because the environment lacks the ability to perceive the signals and propagate it and return value or return truth back, and or because there is a niche for maintaining the failure of the environment to do that. People who are actually intentionally gaming the system. So the answer comes in something like, for example, there's a whole portfolio of things, but the answer comes in something like a uh, intense and significant extinguishing of defection niches that put it outside the threshold of perceived advantage, combined with a significant fraction of a wealth has to be held in commons, and that commons has to be multidimensional. There's a whole multimodality to this that's important. If you try to collapse the modality of value into some narrow modality, maybe if you do it at all, like money takes the diversity of values and collapses it to a single object. This is the kind of thing that makes it both easy to game and difficult to actually achieve your own values. But if it's managed in a highly modal value context, which means, by the way, very peer-to-peer and very moment-to-moment, and actually requires a certain slowness, this has a capacity of perception of what is actually happening, a perception of reality that allows defection to be extinguished vigorously. This shows up as things like killing defectors like rapidly, or more often, by the way, it's actually somewhat kind of some harsh, salient, visceral punishment followed by a joyful ritual of re-engagement with the community, something like that. Like you actually extinguish the meta behavior, not the subsidiary behavior. You extinguish the mindset that plays game theory at all, and orient choice making towards the mindset that can perceive high modal or high modal is the only way to describe it, values, and frankly grasps intrinsically the fact that, for example, all values are cumulative, that you and I can both optimize our values in a way that is actually intrinsically synergistic, while, for example, purposes can be mutually in conflict. There's a distinction between values and purposes, and that we can find out that we are not able to align on purpose, and that my purpose and your purpose may be in conflict, and that would put us in a game theoretic conflict. But we can also understand that we can synergize on our values and therefore actually identify different purposes that we both will feel from the value sense are maybe even more in alignment with our individual and now shared values. And that allows us to actually be intrinsically outside of a game theoretic mindset. That was a melange, not a clear answer. So I apologize. I wasn't able to pull that together particularly well. I'm finding that this audio way, the way that it feels like right now, I don't even know that I'm talking to anybody, makes it difficult for me to hold on to the thread. But that was better than absolute waste of time.
No, not a waste at all. And yeah, sorry, we do need to do this audio, otherwise people can't get into the room. But hopefully they'll allow expansions here on Discord at some point, and it would be great to do this with video. Untitled, who was played a big part in that document that I sent you, asks, actually, did you? Oh, I think he wants me to say it. I'm not sure. Untitled, did you want to ask yourself? Oh, I will ask. Is there a way collectively, objectively, to appraise wisdom in others? Would it be possible for a society to set wisdom requirements on positions that bestow great power?
My instincts say no, and now I have to figure out why that would be the case, which is funny, right? Because it's almost like self-referential. So one characteristic would have to do with the same conversation about the that which can be enumerated in some kind of metricized, like, integer structure. Say objectively, in some sense, means to be able to enumerate, to measure in some kind of discrete sense. And at least in that context, the answer has to be no, because wisdom, by definition, has to do with a capacity that is applied in a given context. And so the context matters. Context matters irreducibly. So, for example, you could imagine you could measure, you could create a test like an SAT for wisdom that would be able to measure the depth, quality of approach. That is doable, and I've actually seen some that exist. But this is really the depth or quality of approach that is taken to a given context, and this can give you a qualitative sense, like, and to some extent a measurable sense that you can differentiate between gross categories or levels. And then there's certainly utility to that. And then Zach Stein I would point to as being a primary person, vastly more capable and informed, or how is this, more capable of saying things than me in this domain. So that's actually rather interesting. So and there's something about even the mindset of the intent or the desire. I mean, this almost feels like it's linked to this notion of technology. To do so, right? To find some way of, hey, can we scale wisdom by being able to automate even the measurement of it, or if not automate, at least be able to have a intersubjective scoring mechanism, and therefore be able to have it kind of attached to an identity as a reputation score. And my sense is that, and by the way, God, I've thought about that a lot, and part of me definitely hopes that the answer is yes. So I have to say that I'm of divided intent, whether or not I'm of divided opinion. And so there's kind of like a rough yes, and it's kind of like, have you guys ever dealt with processes that go through a human to human AI? So instead of a AI that's strictly machinic, it actually has a multiple, it loops. Humans will input, the machine will output, humans will then process that, and then the machine will do something, like you actually loop through it. There may be a way of doing that. For example, you have a multi-layered context that has kind of a machinic layer that has the capacity to do certain levels of orientation and pruning. What it does is it then hands that off to a human layer that is kind of transferring it back into the subjective and the intersubjective. And as long as you maintain this notion of flowing back and forth, and you have to keep symmetry, because the machinic layer can overwhelm the human layer through velocity. And the choice making at the end state is always happening at the human layer, then you start getting something that I think could actually be very functional. Or both dealing with the question of wisdom and empowering wisdom in a more scalable way, and in the role of technology in scaling these systems.
So, related to wisdom, you spoke with John about the critical importance of being able to rightly attune one's attention. How do you think the average person should learn how to do this? So, in other words, how do we become special forces, as you talked about with John?
Wait, say that again.
So, you talked about the importance of being able to rightly attune one's attention, to decide what one should allocate our attention to in our limited time on Earth. I think he called it one of the most precious commodities. For an average person, just the people in this group, how would you recommend?
Yeah, to be perfectly frank, I feel that maybe this is just like super good news. I think this is actually the most average of capacities. Certainly, it's present in infant. So I'll give you an example. Literally a brand newborn, and certainly within the first 3 days, if you say mom is holding the child, and another person, let's say dad, reaches out the hands to create a felt sense of transition, like would you be interested in being held? And this is, by the way, but at the point where the child can't actually visually perceive faces particularly well. Nonetheless, the capacity to sense the presence of a state change and to feel in the body an attraction, repulsion to the opportunity of that state change is there. And then, by the way, to express a preference is also there. It requires some presence on the part of the adults involved to aware of it. But it's that level of basic. And so and I'm just going to call that skill discernment, because why not? We're bandying words about somewhat abusively. But the question, I think, is a question of how do we cultivate in ourselves this most ambient and most basic of human capabilities, and how do we recover to the degree to which we've lost it. I think most of it's in that last category. Most of the problem that I think most people face is that, particularly through education, our basic toolkit has been some combination of blunted and broken and taken away. But the fortunate thing is that starting over at the basics is very simple. So, for example, practice rediscovering what kinds of foods you actually like. Give yourself permission to not have a preconceived notion of what foods you ought to eat and that your body appreciates, and then just try something slowly, thoughtfully, intentionally, and then notice, like, what does it actually feel like, very basically, to have just a gross sense of like yesness or no-ness, for example. You can kind of do that with anything. It's like, in Tai Chi, you can slow things down and make the movement infinitesimal, and that actually is the way that you get the highest felt sense of what right movement is like. All right, that's another example. You can do it in Tai Chi by just simply moving your body 1 centimeter. But what I would recommend is actually doing this across a wide portfolio. And to the degree to which you have skillfulness in some particular domain, you can also hone it at a higher level. Like, let's say you happen to be a graphic designer. Notice the felt sense in you that orients towards what yesness or rightness or yep, that's it, and no, not quite there, feels like. And then just be conscious of the fact that that same thing works everywhere. Now, you may not have built the right kinds of inputs and outputs to be able to deploy it in all domains, but it's the same basic skill. I think, as John mentioned, it may actually be oriented towards like the part of the cortex that's associated with the same like physical balance. Like, there may actually be neurological correlates at the same skill. And so what you can do is you can both hone it vertically in domains where you actually have developed some level of skillfulness. And of course, to say an average person is to say everybody's developed that. It may be you have skillfulness in appreciating a particularly high quality football play in college football. It doesn't matter, right? Just become conscious of how you appreciate skillfulness and how you appreciate the distinction between rightness and wrongness in any domain. And then work on basic ones: food, touch, smell, breathing, pace, like speed, slow things down and speed things up, and notice like which pace is actually more rightness and more wrongness. And then just close the gap, connect the space between the place where you have high skillfulness and the broader capacity, and you'll begin to see these things vectoring towards a higher basis. Yeah, chocolate's good.
Excellent.
Sex is good. Sex is great. Sex is one of the best. Sex and chocolate, for me, are very closely connected.
Thanks. That was great. Coffee, you have a question.
Just that or Cowfee said stepping away for 2
well, I think he actually. Did he say stepping away? Okay, so we'll come back to him. We'll let him ask. Mike G, you have a question, and sorry, did you want me to ask it, or did you want to ask?
Oh man, I'm reading Mike G's question.
People are shy today.
Spoiler alert! I'm reading ahead.
Yeah, I'll just read it for the audience and for YouTube. The vastness of the conversation about the written are, as well as notions around the meaning crisis and sense-making arenas, appear to be touching upon, if not wholly revolve around the sacred or divine, a concept in and of itself that I feel is fully defined but constantly alluded to, or in other instances, willfully utilizing suggestive words associated toward, but intentionally holding back from committing to outright real presence or intentional communion with this, for lack of a better term, sacred or divine. I've been struggling with how a writtenar could actually work, and oftentimes sounds or feels a fear that this conception is challenged because of an outgrowth of historical antipathy to religion. With this in mind, what would you consider the opposition or challenge to creating a religion or calling it for what it is, that is a religion. And just for the YouTube audience, Ritnar stands for the religion that's not a religion.
Okay, good. I'm actually really glad to have this question because it's come up a few times in certain comments, and I think it's timely to address it. Earlier, I referenced a particular tribe that made the point of not writing down the name of the divine, and being quite careful about that and circumspect. And I think there's a good reason for that, and I think that's the answer to the question. To define, to endeavor to define, to endeavor to so fully pierce the veil of mystery as to render it no longer mystery is defilement. It's in fact it is the essence and the intuition of the profane. So to hold the sacred sacred has a certain requirement. And part of that is to actually recognize that there's a way of feeling and being in relationship, which is to say to know, knowing deeply and without this least bit of question that the divine is, that must by necessity avoid at all costs any effort to put the divine on the rack of definition and to render it merely propositional. So this, I think, is the thing that is trying to be held with the na in the Ritnar construct. And I get it. I get the fact that there has been, for at least the past 150 or 200 years, and increasingly over the past several decades, a building default state of antipathy to religions and to religion in general. And I get it. I get both the thing that gave rise to that antipathy and to the degree to which that is a problem. It has a lot of error behind it. But what I'd like to propose is that the right answer is in some sense neither. That the reason why and the thing that causes the thing that has been called religion to go off the rails is precisely the profaning of the sacred, like the forgetting of the necessity of recognizing that the transcendent is transcendent, and that as we endeavor to name it, we can be helpful, but also can create enormous amounts of confusion and harm, because almost everybody takes the finger for the moon, and everybody else takes the moon for the moon. That's a real problem. So endeavoring to actually deconstruct that in the center, Ritnar, to say, hey, we're going to be doing this thing that if we call it, the second we call it a religion, we've already broken faith with that which is most sacred. If we are living it without calling it, and that's the distinction that I just like to put out there. The whole point of religion that makes it a real thing that is viable in the world is not the naming of it or the calling of it, or certainly not the thinking about it, but it is the livingness of it, the living through it, the bringing people into being in the world in a certain way and cultivating them in certain relationships with each other, themselves, the world, that is simultaneously the name of the divine in its most fully realized form and the meaningfulness of religion that we can then protect by calling it not a religion, being very careful not to fall into that trap of trying to name God.
All right, thank you. I think Coffee's back. Go ahead, Coffee.
Oh, awesome. Thanks. Jordan, thanks for this again. Given your experience in technology, product strategy, and management, and that's kind of where I play today, it would seem that there's a role of technology in scaling these types of systems and practices. And I'm just wondering if you can share, how you think about building solutions that can facilitate things like this. There were some examples given of decentralized platforms like blockchain, and perhaps once society adopts that at a broader scale, that might be viable. But I'm just thinking about other ways that technology can help contribute to it. So appreciate your thoughts.
Oh gosh, you're welcome. I wish they were better. What I can say is that I have struggled with trying to get a good answer to this question for about 2 decades now. And I can say that my intuitions, as somebody who came up through technology, have proven to be largely wrong. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that it's very important for me to be careful, not to go too fast through what I would consider kind of like the ordinary techniques of scalability, and even systems design. And to be very, very mindful of where I guess my instincts, or maybe even the instincts of technological civilization, oftentimes leads us awry. So I'll give you an example. Um, Nature typically doesn't scale, and so if you design something that does scale, one of the things that's going to happen is you'll be upregulating some subset of reality to a much higher level than is available in all the rest of the aspects of reality that are not being thus scaled. And so therefore it can be quite trivial to accidentally break homeostatic systems apart. Problems of accumulation and extraction, as Daniel has mentioned, and Daniel Schmachtenberger has mentioned in different contexts. So the answer I've actually found is that we, those who are systems designers and technologists, actually have to up our game quite substantially before I think we're actually going to be truly effective. Now, in some sense, that's okay, because it's actually a relatively new discipline. Even computer science by itself is only, 5 decades old, full stop. And think about how much havoc economics has wrought by trying to wield power in its adolescence. So a bit of humility to say, hey, we have a fundamental, not even a meaningful, but a fundamental role to play, to say technologists, and also we're not yet capable to play that role fully. So let's go into it. Let's take it seriously and really take a look at what are the key problems of how we can think about how do you scale homeostatically? How do you actually think about whole systems design? And how do you make sure that you're actually upregulating the intrinsics of integral systems that are able to grow without breaking symmetry relationships that then cause whole chunks of complexity to shatter? The kinds of questions that were asked in terms of database theory in the 70s, we should be asking those questions in terms of the relationship between complexity and complicatedness now. Well, 10 years ago, unfortunately. That would then give us a lot more power. And let me throw out, so that's one angle. That's called the angle of humility, and taking our humility pills seriously, and then recognizing that we can do it. We just have to be more diligent and focused. 2 more pieces, actually. So the next piece, we are ever since, and I'm just going to personify it, ever since Alan Turing, we technologists have been I think in many ways, some combination of unwitting, unwilling, and perhaps, how would I say this, resentful or unethical handmaidens to destruction in every dimension, not just weapons of mass destruction in the military context, but in any context, obviously, since the 1940s, the way to win was to get the best technology on your side. And the implications, for example, in AI research says that the place that has the highest degree of likelihood of exponential technology being exponential, because the competition be the one technology that achieves decisive strategic advantage, is the hottest, multiplied by rivalrous competition leading to extinction. That's part 2. Part 2 is that we have to be mindful that if we, among all else, literally every other kind of human being on the planet, play into rivalrous game theory, we are the exponent of exponential tech. That's how it happens. And either we have to be the guy from Cyberdyne Systems in Terminator 2 and collectively kill ourselves to prevent a bad future from happening, or we have to really figure out how to hold our hand in the game of competition against each other, either directly or as someone else's pawns, so as to not tip that scale. But then you have the third, right? And the third piece has to do with the fact that this domain, the anti-rivalrous, which is the location of abundance, the location of the possibility of a level of generativity that completely changes the nature of what it means to be embodied beings in the world, is also our playground, right? That's what technologists are in. So as we increase our skillfulness, we can also increase our artfulness. And it is only through, and it is through the generativity of the anti-rivalrous that we can actually liberate people willy-nilly. And I don't mean that just theoretically. I mean, theoretically, I can state it categorically. Practically speaking, for example, if we imagine a context where an ethical community begins the process of empowering technologists to ethically and thoughtfully design most powerful, durable, empowering, and ethical platforms, the advantages of recombinant anti-rivalrousness begins to become a massive engine, right? Because every time that platform becomes richer, the value is shared across everybody who's on the platform exponentially, and you start getting acceleration. So as much as I say that we hold a lot of the burdens, I would say that we also hold, in many ways, the key to the possibility of actually liberation. So the answer is weird. Like, the answer doesn't, as far as I can tell, doesn't come through using the stuff we're really good at, analytical reasoning and stuff like that. It comes through two things. One is actually finding ways to form the right kinds of relationships with the right kinds of skill sets that support us well. There's this book I mentioned that Jim recommended, the Indigenous gentleman from Australia. He has a technique he calls yarning, YARNING, like to spin a yarn, to tell a tale. That's a really cool change from the notion of requirements gathering, like co-creative weaving, and actually playing a role in the co-creative weaving and recognizing exactly what your role is to play and thinking about how you move it. Sorry, I definitely meandered there, but I think there was some pretty good stuff there in the beginning.
No, definitely. I appreciate it.
We just have a few minutes left. We're a little bit more than an hour. Do you have time for just a few more?
Yeah, I think 2 more would be good.
Okay, great. Well, first, one very short one, but I think very important, from Tyler. Chocolate is the best flow state. Yes or no?
No.
No, that wasn't a real question.
I know. I was having fun.
You have a real question, if I
I
could.
had to think about it. I mean, chocolate's a good flow state, but the thing about chocolate is that you can mix chocolate with other things, and
Correct.
are synergistic.
Yeah, it's a topping, let's say. Okay, so no, let me just squeeze in a real question if I can, because I've interrupted it already. Anyways, your work and coming into contact with this stuff that you've been doing has kind of catapulted me into quite an adventure the past few years. And one of the first pieces that I smashed headlong into is, let's say, the notion of humility in systems design, and doing any kind of engineering work and trying to get complex systems to coordinate well. And so it's partially that which has led me to the spot that I'm in now, in attempts to understand the scalability issue, and somewhat also of something like a measurement issue, where the influence in the system when you're taking a look at it has a profound impact. But I'm curious about this notion, right? Like, is this a place? Is something like this digital landscape a place where we can iterate in the same way that evolution solved the hard problem of the open-ended question of suitability or adaptability by just iterative design? Can we do that here in this space, where we do eventually solve this fundamental relational problem that seems to be cropping up so persistently in human evolution? I get the sense that this is kind of a key piece in order for the rest of it to fall together, and that maybe it's tied into Civium and all of that, right? So yeah, sorry, let me lob that in there, and thanks.
Yeah, that's a really deep question. The language actually has to do with the proposition, epistemologically, that there is a distinction between what you might call evolutionary process and what you might call design process. And I should say, I've been in a lot of arguments about this, and I've been on both sides of the argument. So one might argue, for example, the design process is just rapidly iterated evolutionary process. But the hypothesis, and I now agree with the hypothesis that's not the case, is and maybe a way of linking into it. And I hate to do this because it feels like it's terribly abusing the concepts, but the distinction between traditional computing and quantum computing, that there's a way to approach a particular problem domain that is kind of operates in terms of an intrinsic wholeness, and either holds together or doesn't. But it doesn't get there through an iterative process, certainly not an iterative analytic process. And it cannot be formally modeled as such. So which is to say that it's not that you move towards wholeness and then you don't get there, so you try a different analytic variation, because it's not a summing of discrete states. It's something else. And that elseness is the whole point, by the way, for those of us who are talking about the early thing. That elseness might precisely be that thing that shouldn't be spoken of. But a way of being in relationship with that elseness, actually using a very different modality of sense making, different modality of perception that operates in terms of integrated wholeness and allows us to be able to perceive subtly and then begin to move from subtlety into increasing concreteness with something that sort of just comes together. I think, given, and this is just, now we're kind of in the middle of it, with I think it's a very ripe and powerful question. That's my current proposition. My current proposition is that the primary capacity that needs to be built in those who are doing that kind of work is that kind of capacity. And then as that skillfulness gets to be built, the awkwardness of the language I'm using right now will become a lot less awkward, and we'll be able to have a whole awesome vocabulary for describing these kinds of things, and it will turn out to be compatible with an adjunct to the kind of iterative process that we can for sure run in digital space. But I want to actually hold these are, as far as I can tell, distinct, and it's crucial to actually be held distinct, and that the set of questions that are appropriate for one is not actually endeavored to be accomplished through the other.
Yeah. That I mean, it's really interesting, especially that relationship between evolution and design, right? Because when you think about the way that, in the genotype and in the fundamental transmission of the information that's encoded in me, it's a very distinct, discrete state, right? It's a propositional state, the genetic code, which is then expressed through some series of magical transformations into a layer which is no longer essentially propositional, right? It's now this embodied perspectival musical quality that's the coordination of this vast sea of kind of orchestrated cycles, and that is in fact the place where the testing of that propositional code embedded in the DNA occurs. My individual life, right? The somatic expression of that germ line is the testing point, and that's
right.
Yes,
that's right, exactly. And actually, hold on to that. That's beautiful. The transition from what is effectively the phenomenal touches the noumenal by going through that transition. And if it doesn't go through that transition, it doesn't actually get a checksum, which is the thing that makes it possible to go through this thing, fitness. And the other one that came to mind as you were talking is the experience of the transition from quantity to quality that is actually very commonplace, which is what happens when you take rhythm, BPM, and you accelerate BPM until it goes through this transition where our ear goes from hearing it as a linear quantity, number of uniform beats that are happening in time, to a quality, a tone, a note occurs. And now I'm actually listening to middle C, which of course is expressed in terms of hertz, right? It actually can be thought of as being nothing more than a unity of quantity, but there's almost this verticality where the horizontal dimension actually does become a vertical dimension. And that fact, or the reality of the transition that you just talked about from the genetic code to the UNIS, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And if we can hold that and find a way to actually play within that space and be able to start doing that with more thoughtfulness and intentionality, then we're onto something.
Agreed.
All right. So last question. So from David, how do you personally, and I'd like to broaden it to how would you recommend it for us too? How would you figure out how to manage information and prioritize what to read, learn with so much out there and not to fall to information overwhelm?
I use magic. But fortunately for me, it turns out that comes quite naturally. I noticed, I think probably my sophomore year of college, that I had an experience that wasn't commonplace. That's that books in particular, like physical books, actually have a certain aesthetic quality to them. So when I look at a title of a book, it'll have like a color or a taste. And what I noticed is that I had a certain, if I attended to that, if I actually allowed that to guide me in my allocation of attention, it kind of worked. And so, I got to say, like Gilles Deleuze, Manuel de Landa tastes very much like Gilles Deleuze. And so it was easy for me to know that within sentences of reading War in the Age of Intelligent Machines, that was going to be a delicious fucking meal. And devoured it. And by contrast, for example, it was simply intrinsically the case that as I was reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, that I was like, ugh, this has a lot of it feels heavy. It feels very fucking dramatic. It feels like there's a lot of cream. I have an upset stomach by the end of this, and so I read it, but I could tell already that I was actually feeling myself just kind of sorting through it and scanning and looking for the little tiny pieces that did have a glow to them. Now, what the hell does that mean? That's a good question. To be perfectly honest, I do not know. But what I can hypothesize that there's again back to that felt sense of rightness. Like there's a reality. It's this broad capacity, like this vast evolutionary capacity to like not get eaten by lions and to eat plants that don't poison you. That if you sort of put all of that to bear, just allow the whole sensorium, the totality of all of your processing capacity that has been honed to protect you and to support you and to help you, and then you allow yourself to use that to guide you. That's the best you're going to do. Like just analytically, for sure, that's the best you're going to do. And so the challenge is kind of to say, okay, let me work backwards. Let me. How can I most effectively use that? And my guess is that in reality, everybody actually has that. Just for the most part, we haven't trained ourselves and have not been trained. Certainly, we have not been trained, but we have not trained ourselves to put those resources to use. So I would practice, for example, what's that called? Right, improvisation, or particularly collaborative improvisation, because that felt sense of being able to get the flow of what's being offered and the possibility of the conversation, like that's the skill, that's the technique, right? You're finding it. Where's the sweet spot? And you can just like, oh yeah, okay, I'm seeing this particular conversation, I'm reading this text, I'm feeling like, where's the sweet spot? We're all in some gigantic improvisational play. Like think of it as one huge field. It's not a series of discrete opportunities to allocate your attention. It's a single moment, and your job is to actually find the sweet spot in that single moment. And so anything that is uniquely of the characteristic that develops and hones your skillfulness in finding that sweet spot, do that. Be good at it. Fly sideways to a very different domain until you're able to generalize, and boom, you're running.
Is there a place where you go into this much deeper, other podcasts or so forth?
Probably. I have another thing I have to confess, which is I actually have, particularly when I'm saying something that's actually proven in the like other people say, oh, that was good, that was useful. I don't know what I'm talking. I don't recall that I said anything. I actually don't even recall the time passing. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a fugue state. So, and I can't really stand the sound of my own voice, and I don't like listening to things that I've done. So I don't really have any idea, to be perfectly frank, what I've said or what I've done. Except for the degree which other people have kind of reflected it back to me. So I guess I'm betting that at least once or twice this topic has come up, and perhaps in a context where it has been given some more color, maybe with the future thinkers. That's actually all I can say. Other people might know. There are some people who have actually listened to a shockingly large amount of crap that I've said, and may actually have a better sense of what might be the best or better stuff.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I know the Future Thinkers series you did on the learning how to learn the deep code, I think, and you did one with David G, and he kind of questioned you on the synesthesia part, but those are the ones that I know. Anyways.
Okay, yeah. So sorry I can't be of more help.
Well, no, you've been of plenty help today. This has been a completely engaging session, and I really appreciate you coming by and giving us your time and your wisdom. And this, I know I'm going to have to go back and listen to a lot of this a few times. And thank you for all, especially that advice on setting up this Discord. So thank you so much for being here today, Jordan.
You're welcome. My pleasure. I hope everybody had a good time. I hope there were more than the 5 voices on the call. I can't ever tell.
Yeah, well, people were more shy tonight, but I do encourage people to ask their own questions. But I'm perfectly happy to read them out, and you're welcome back anytime. Maybe we can invite you back after you speak with John again. It'd be, we'd love to have you.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear. I feel very intrigued to see how this particular community evolves. I'm delighted to know that it exists and that there's a real number of people here. And I also love the notion that there's this Brett Weinstein Discord and this Eric Weinstein Discord. And obviously it's not strictly Discord, there's groups else everywhere, but something about that feels really right. About the discovery and the emergence of people choosing to enter into deliberate and intentional, and in some cases hard-won community that are distinct and yet able to then interrelate with each other. Like that feels like a very useful thing to do these days.
Yeah, definitely. And Tyler, for example, is very focused on sort of bringing these communities together and sort of bridging between them. And, so a lot of our members, we have overlap with Eric Weinstein's server, with Paul Vanderklay's server, with a lot of with some of the Stoa server. So there's a lot of overlap, and we're definitely trying to encourage those type of relations.
I apologize. I just had something come to my mind that I'd like to add. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
It has to do with this question of information overwhelm. So this is actually very practical. One of the things that I have built as a technique when encountering the problem of information overwhelm is to go up or to go in. So when a particular event is occurring, I mean, we could just pick anything, but let's go with coronavirus, COVID. And there's a large amount of information, particularly a lot of information that's at the same kind of epistemological level, epidemiology information, for example. What I find is that there's a way of noticing when you've reached a point where you almost get like diminishing returns of continuing to operate at that level. And then the right answer, and by the way, you can say it, I'm beginning to feel information overwhelm. Like that's maybe a good way of noticing it. And then there's a way of either choosing to go up or in. So up would be like, if you think about geometry, could you think about it from the point of view of a higher level geometry? Like, is there a topological way of thinking about this entire thing? You don't have to worry about the flood of information that can actually collapse all of that down to a single point. This is something that Eric Weinstein is comprehensively good at. And then there's in, let's just say, let me just actually move entirely from the informational domain and just contemplate. You just sort of chew on this thing and not even try to be in a relationship with it at all in the informational domain. Then notice if anything comes up that has that kind of that felt sense of aha, or some shift has occurred or an insight. And generally speaking, if I find myself in a place where information overwhelm is happening, I have enough practice these days to be conscious of that, and then to do one of these two or both moves. And I have to say, it's always the right move. I've never once had that happen and not been very happy that I chose to go in that direction. So that's that.
Great, thank you for the encore. Thanks again, Jordan, for being here. Thank you everyone for listening. Tyler for recording. Just heads up. So at 9:30 Eastern tonight, we're trying out a new ritual. Speaking of rituals, the sacrifice of sentiment. And you can take a look if you look in our Google Calendar, there's a full description, and we'll put it up in the announcements. Tomorrow we're trying to get another ritual, the prayer of presence, air, and these are both come up by Callie, who's here now. So we're experimenting and seeing what works, what we resonate with, and as well as Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern, Christopher Mastropietro will be here for a Q&A. So he's John's long-term partner, research partner, and I think that'll be a great discussion.
That's awesome. All right, guys. Thank you. I'm going to get out of here.
Thanks, Jordan.
Bye.
You take care. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.